Yeah, it's definitely surprising because Venezuela appeared to be picked first because it has the largest oil reserve in the world, and we almost always attack countries with large oil reserves. But I think that I have a different theory on why we're going there, and it might surprise you. So let's find out why it might not be the oil companies.
All right, welcome back to Straight Fire Politics. So, Trump literally asked oil executives if they wanted Venezuelan oil, and they said no. That's wild. Let's break down why.
And then talk about why we might be going to war with Venezuela anyway.
Oil companies had a fascinating response to President Donald Trump, who asked executives in said oil companies if they have any interest in returning to Venezuela once Nicolas Maduro is ousted in a regime change war. And so far, the answer is a hard no. That's what Politico is reporting, and I am super shocked by that. Cenk, what are your 2 cents?
Yeah, it's definitely surprising because Venezuela appeared to be picked first because it has the largest oil reserve in the world, and we almost always attack countries with large oil reserves. But I think that I have a different theory on why we're going there, and it might surprise you. So let's find out why it might not be the oil companies, and then talk about why we might be going to war with Venezuela anyway.
So the answer that Trump received, which I'm sure he didn't like, from these oil industry executives, is likely due to the current oil markets, right? The fact that the oil supply has been increased, which means more supply, prices come down. So the US benchmark oil price was around $56 a barrel as of Wednesday afternoon. And that's actually the lowest it's been since January of 2021. Here in California, we're not feeling the relief because they tax the crap out of gas here, and we're still paying like at least 4.50 a gallon if you're lucky. But anyway, this has given Trump some wiggle room to attack Venezuela without too much concern about oil prices being impacted to a point where things are unaffordable. So he's like, all right, I got some wiggle room. But the increased supply is also having the opposite effect on these oil companies. Those prices are also way too low to entice companies to take the risk of pouring huge investments into the crumbling Venezuelan oil facilities that former strongman Hugo Chavez seized decades ago, industry officials and analysts said. And I want to just quickly correct something that I said on the show yesterday.
Wait, hold up. Trump said Venezuela stole our oil, their oil. It's literally in their ground. But this is how empire brains work. We act like resources in other countries belong to us. That's the whole game.
Trump said something about how Venezuela stole our oil. And I'm like, what? What does he even mean by that? I think he's referring to what Chavez had done under his leadership. And so US oil companies have better investment options elsewhere, according to one person who's familiar with the discussions. And then two people familiar with Trump's efforts say that the administration has only recently started initiating the outreach to the industry. It's not as straightforward to convince companies to risk capital in an uncertain political environment, one of those people said. Now, I've got more details on Trump's conversations with these oil executives. So, for instance, Evanon Romero, who is a former executive at the Venezuelan state-owned oil company known as Petróleos de Venezuela, now works as a consultant in Houston and is actually part of this opposition effort against Maduro, right? So in late November, the Trump administration met with Exxon, ConocoPhillips, and representatives of the Venezuelan opposition group to which Romero belongs, although he wasn't at this particular meeting. The meeting was led by the Energy Secretary, Chris Wright, and the discussion centered on the possibility of the two oil majors returning to Venezuela, right? Now, Romero said Exxon and ConocoPhillips aired concerns about the debt they are owed from their past Venezuela operations. And the Venezuela representatives floated the opportunity to take control of additional fields to compensate for the debt. So, what does that mean? So, US oil companies were actually operating in Venezuela. Chevron still does. Chevron has some sort of deal with Venezuela, and apparently they're happy with it. It's working out for them. But other oil companies were also operating out of Venezuela previously. This is like in the early 2000s when Hugo Chavez suddenly decided to force them to give majority stakes of their projects to the Petroleos de Venezuela, to the state essentially. He wanted to nationalize the oil.
So here's what's really happening. Chavez says, hey, this is our oil. We should control it. And American companies lost their minds. They're still mad about this decades later. That's what this debt is really about, losing control of someone else's resources.
So Venezuela ended up seizing the assets of companies that resisted, and that's the debt that these oil companies are referring to. Now, again, Chevron has been the sole major oil company to continue working in Venezuela, operating under a special license to produce oil in the country and then export it to the United States. But Romero said that Wright, again, Wright's the energy secretary, encouraged the companies, quote, to get an understanding and solve their outstanding problems along the way, end quote, but made clear, this is an important part of the story, made clear the Trump administration would like to see more Venezuelan crude flowing to US refineries. I thought that was an interesting part of the story because Trump very recently trashed the oil in Venezuela. It's like, it's nasty oil. We don't want that oil. It's like, is it though? Finally, Romero says, we need those barrels. That's an important message from the government.
So the oil companies don't even want it, which means this Venezuela move is about something entirely different. Drop a comment. What do you think is really driving this? Hit that like button, subscribe, and I will see you in the next one.